Salutations to the Truth Core, whoever and wherever you may be on the planet. Now here's an anecdote for you. 30 years ago in 1990, I was writing The Seeker's Handbook. It was my first published book, and it came out in March of 1991. At that time I was living in Santa Fe, and there was a major New Age publisher there called Bear and Company, run by a woman and her husband, but mainly by the woman, Barbara Hand Clow, C-L-O-W. And she was quite a prominent figure in the New Age community of Santa Fe, and continued to be for a number of years. So as I was writing the book, I first created a book proposal and naturally took it to her. Bear and Company was located about a 15-minute walk from where I lived, down by the Santa Fe rail yard and Tomasita's, a great restaurant. And so I started work on the manuscript. I called Barbara and I went down to see her, and she was immediately enthused, liked the whole project. And so we started to talk about contracting. As things evolved, it turned out that she was going to offer me a $1,000 advance. She was a bit pushy, I thought, mainly because she said, well, I said, look, I'm just starting it, and I'll have the full manuscript for you, say, in 4 or 5 months. And she said, oh, no. Why don't you bring it in while you're working on it? And that way I can look it over and we can speed up the publication. We hadn't signed a contract yet. And I remember she used the expression, she said, I can do macro editing. And that was the first time I heard that expression. So there's micro editing, which means proofreading and minor corrections of grammar and so forth, conventional usage of terms and punctuation. And then there's macro editing, which means actually editing the content. So I complied with her pushiness, and I went down a few days later and I said, look, here's the beginning of the lexicon. Now I've done A to F, so I gave her A to F. She said, oh great, I'll start looking at it right now. So then I went back, wrote some more, and I had more of the lexicon ready, from F to M or something like that. So I walked back down through the town, through the plaza, to give her the second batch. And then we sat there in her office, and she pulled out the papers I had given her, the manuscript, and she said, okay, this is ready, take this back with you. And we discussed it a little. And as I was sitting there across from her desk, she was going through the lexicon, and she pointed out that she had taken out an entry. She showed it to me. She had crossed it out. And she said, well, this isn't necessary. So I took the manuscript back home with me. I went over what she'd done, and I saw that the entry she had edited out, she had removed from the lexicon, was the word authenticity. So in the view of Barbara Hand Clow, back then 30 years ago, the word authenticity was irrelevant and unnecessary in any generic or panoramic discussion of the many paths of modern spirituality, which is what my book was about, right? What's the subtitle? The Complete Guide to Spiritual Pathfinding. Well, at that moment, I decided that Barbara Hand Clow was not the editor, and Bear and Company was not the publisher for my book, and I took another route. I bring that anecdote up because it refers to the position I now take and have taken for a number of years That is to say, I don't use the word spirituality anymore. And I've advised my students and friends, all my true students are my friends, allies, to look very closely at that word, those words, and consider that they are useless. They are outworn. They are dead cliches. At the same time, consistent with the discipline of a Gnostic teacher, I offer something, I contribute something to replace those terms. So the word that I use now for what would normally be called spirituality is mantique. M-A-N-T-I-Q-U-E, mantique. You see? It's sort of like critique, mantique. So mantique, what does mantique mean? And how do I intend that word to replace spirituality in the Gnostic view of life? Well, it comes from the Greek word, which you find in Plato, and which relates in a profound way to the mysteries, as noted in the Symposium, particularly the mysteries of Eros. You find in the Symposium an interesting interchange with Socrates. Now, it is said that Socrates was never initiated into the mysteries of Eleusis, which was located near Athens. And yet, in the Symposium, Socrates tells the story of his encounter with a great witch called Diotima, who lived in the Peloponnesus. And he claims that he went to the Peloponnesus, which is rare because Socrates didn't often leave town, in order to be initiated into the mysteries of Eros by Diotima. Beautiful name, isn't it? Diotima. So she was a great witch. She was a clairvoyant. She was a Pythoness, that is to say, a female shaman who could divine the messages coming from the depths of the earth. The female oracles at Delphi were called by that name, Pythoness, in reference to Python, which is a name for Kundalini, or the Mahakundala serpent power of the planet itself. So you find in a Symposium and elsewhere in ancient Greek writings the word mantique in Greek, which means divination. And the person who could divine was called a mantis. So you could say that someone who has the power of mantique is mantic. So there you have a noun, mantique, to replace spirituality, and you have an adjective, mantic, to replace spiritual. So why do I propose these Greek words as neologisms, new terms, new expressions, to replace the outworn terms of spiritual and spirituality? Well, what is spirituality? What do you say if you have ever said or thought, I'm a spiritual person, I am interested in spirituality? What do you mean by that? What is the generic or categorical common use of those words? Well, as far as I can tell, spirituality is used to mean, at its best now, this is its best generic application as far as I know, it's used to mean an interest in consciousness. So you can distinguish it in that way from religion. So people often say, well, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual. I mean, haven't you heard that? Perhaps you said it yourself. why would anyone make that distinction? Well, quite simply, to say, I'm not religious, I'm not into dogmas, I'm not into doctrines, I'm not into institutional religion, but I'm spiritual. I have an interest in consciousness. You know, if you go look at religion, the Abrahamic religions, you find that they don't tell you anything about consciousness. If you go and look at Buddhism and Hinduism, you find that they do have a lot to say about consciousness. So it's fair to argue that Buddhism and Hinduism and Taoism and Zen and all those things are really spiritual, because when you get into those fields, you learn about the nature of consciousness and how it works and the nature of the mind. So if you are interested in the nature of the mind, in consciousness itself, what is consciousness? How does it work? How does it work in me? How can I operate my consciousness? How can I operate and optimize my intelligence? It's fair to say, okay, then you're spiritual and you are seeking some path of spirituality, some technique of spirituality, and that plays pretty well. I would accept marginally the use of those terms in that context. But I submit to you that mantique and mantic go you one better. So let me explain why. I have here The Seeker's Handbook in my lap, the hardcover, published in 1991. And I'm not even going to drag you through the dozens of paths and techniques and teachings and systems of metaphysics and spirituality that I covered in that book. It was meant to be a compass for, quote, spiritual pathfinding, unquote. So at that time, and even today, marginally, I would allow that there are a large number of teachings and systems that you could call spiritual. For instance, the 7 laws of hermetics, the Gurdjieff teachings. Theosophy says a lot about consciousness, although it's more of a religious system than a spiritual system. What else? I mean, I can't even remember all of the things I covered in the Seeker's Handbook. The Arantia book, which is a big narrative but contains certain statements. Any system of metaphysics that is constructed on the intention to explain where consciousness comes from and what it is and how it operates in the universe and how your consciousness operates and how you can carry it to its optimal level of function is spirituality. So I covered all of these spiritual programs, anthroposophy, and so forth and so on. Like I said, I'm not going to bore you with the entire list. However, I propose mantique, divination, with this implication. If you're interested in consciousness and the mind and the nature of mind and the ultimate cosmic origin, not only of human existence, the material existence of humanity in the earth, but of consciousness itself, which of course is one of the subjects of Hindu and Vedic philosophy, well, you might learn a lot of things. You might master various metaphysical systems, such as the system built by P.D. Uspensky, based on the work of Gurdjieff, or the system developed by Rodney Collins, based on Gurdjieff. You might develop a whole framework of metaphysical ideas and notions and concepts and propositions and paradigms that explain consciousness. But none of that assures or guarantees that you will actually and actionally practice what you know about consciousness. To practice what you know about it every day, every moment, to put into action what you have come to understand about the human mind, that is mantique. You have to prove it. I have met so many people, and during the time that I wrote The Seeker's Handbook, I knew dozens and dozens of them in Santa Fe who were involved in one or another metaphysical and spiritual system, and they did not in any way show that they were applying that system in a realistic or existential manner. In other words, they couldn't prove or demonstrate that they were spiritual, even though they claimed to be. So mantique is the demonstration that you are spiritual, the demonstration that you know something about the mind and consciousness. So why do I call that divination? Well, divination, understood in this sense, is something quite wonderful. Divination means that you can read phenomenon. You can read, this is the classical meaning, you can read the sky, the flight of birds. You can read the patterns of the currents of water in a streaming brook. You can read everything in the natural world, in the apparent and material world, and you can read the significance of it as it unfolds as an event in nature and simultaneously an event in your own psyche. That's divination. To be able to divine, to have mantique, is the proof of real spirituality. And spirituality is nothing if you can't prove it and show that you have it, how you have it, how you use it, and how you share it. The way that a Gnostic today comprehends mantique is simple. Consider the assertion, and I'm making to you right now, from me to you, that in the skill set of your faculties as a human being, there is a particular component which is the capacity to divine. So you have the capacity to divine. You have mantique installed innately in your intelligence as a human animal. So it's not something invented. Has nothing to do with a metaphysical system that you take on from elsewhere. Mantique, the capacity to divine, is innate to your intelligence, just like common sense is, just like practical abilities are. That's what I maintain. That point is one of the points which I put forward to maintain that there is something special and unique about the word mantique, and since it rhymes, it must be true. So in concluding, I advise you, I do dare to do so, and I invite you to look into planetary tantra. That is an elaborate and sophisticated but elementary system of mantique. It contains the framing paradigm for mantique and many specific techniques for mantique. Again, that's a close rhyme. No, it's an exact rhyme. Technique, mantique. So it may come about one day that you would enjoy saying that you're involved in mantique, you are learning divination, the practical application of consciousness in its transcendental aspects as well as its common sense aspects, and you could call yourself mantic. To complete the anecdote, I didn't contract with Bear and Company. I took another route which led me into a situation where I found myself as a writer facing the first opportunity to publish professionally. I found myself in a bidding war, as it's called, between two of the biggest publishing companies in the United States, Crown on the East Coast, and I forget what the other one was in San Francisco on the West Coast. And I had a situation where I was offered a $5,000 advance, and because they were bidding against each other, it eventually went to $25,000, and I managed that transaction myself. So I got a $25,000 advance for The Seeker's Handbook, my first book. I'll have you know that to this day, well, it's out of print now, and all copies of The Seeker's Handbook that are sold on the internet through various outlets, including Amazon.com, all those copies are still circulating, but I receive nothing from the sales of The Seeker's Handbook. Such is the fate of a writer. Enough said, and I'll be seeing you in the beauty to come.